We expect politicians to lie to us, but we don't expect scientists to. But that's exactly what happened. Anthony Fauci hasn't been telling the truth, and he's been caught. The Fauci era is officially over. The cover-up's crashing down. But for the Democrats, he's too big to fail. And the media is doing everything it can to preserve the Fauci legacy. But there's no turning back now. Hundreds of pages of his emails throughout the pandemic have been revealed. The emails don't look good for Fauci, the scientific community, and the U.S. government. Stay with us here because it gets messy. On January 31st, 2020, top scientist Christian Andersen warned Fauci that the virus, quote, potentially looked engineered and had unusual features. The very next day, Fauci replied and said they'd talk later. He started to get worried. Fauci sent an important email to 𝗙𝗘𝗢𝗥𝗗𝗧𝗥𝗢, his underling, and wrote, quote, "It is essential that we speak this morning. Read this paper. You will have tasks that must be done." With this email, he attached a PDF called 𝗏𝗏 Nature Medicine SARS Gain of Function. Ralph Baric, a COVID researcher at the University of North Carolina, trained bat lady, 𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗥𝗗𝗔𝗗𝗢𝗢. She was the top researcher at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They worked together to manipulate viruses to attack other species, including humans. Baric and Bat Lady were both funded by Anthony Fauci. The 2015 paper written by Bat Lady and Ralph Baric show they were creating coronaviruses with the highest possible infectivity rate for human cells. In the paper, they even wrote how risky it was, adding that this research was funded by the National Institutes of Health, aka Fauci. Fauci funneled the money through a nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance. We've told you about it, and we'll get into it later. Now, Fauci denied to Congress that Ralph Baric had done gain-of-function research when asked by Rand Paul. Fauci lied. 𝗙𝗘𝗢𝗥𝗗𝗧𝗥𝗢 replied to Fauci's email, quote, "The paper you sent me says the experiments were performed before the gain-of-function pause, but have since been reviewed and approved by NIH. Not sure what that means. She, a woman named Emily, will try to determine if we have any distant ties to this work abroad." Smoking gun. Fauci sent taxpayer money to Wuhan labs that juiced viruses to attack humans. The U.S. government signed off on this for years. Fauci here's scrambling just to see if his fingerprints are on it, and they are. Fauci then had a call with Christian Andersen after that meeting. Andersen later, in March 2020, wrote an article saying the lab leak theory was not true. Emails show Fauci advised on that paper. Then Fauci publicly denied the lab leak theory, using the very same article as a source, withholding his involvement in it.
You address these suggestions or concerns that this virus was somehow man-made?
A group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists looked at the sequences there and the sequences in bats as they evolve, and the mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
No, it's not. And that is the beginning of the cover-up. Vanity Fair reports State Department officials were told not to look into gain-of-function research in order to protect the U.S., since we funded the Wuhan lab. More specifically, Fauci funded it. When a State Department group found that 3 Wuhan lab researchers doing gain-of-function research became sick with COVID-like symptoms in 2019, some officials in our government told them not to say anything publicly that could implicate us. One of the officials who said not to speak of it, Christopher Park, the director in the State Department's biological policy staff. This is the same guy who in 2017 played a part in lifting the pause on gain-of-function, funding that Fauci's underling had mentioned that we talked about earlier. This research was so risky, America had to pause it. But we didn't. It kept going. In another memo Vanity Fair got access to, State Department officials were told not to look further into COVID origins because it would, quote, open a can of worms. Four former State Department officials were reportedly told not to, quote, open Pandora's box. It was a cover-up. Fauci was implicated, and therefore the U.S. would be implicated. America pays for products made in China, except this time we paid for a pandemic. And Fauci was worried. On February 1st, Fauci spoke with top virologists. The call was in reference to a document called Coronavirus Sequence Comparison. Now, we don't know exactly what happened on that call, but we do know that it was a highly secret call. Jeremy Farrar, a British physician, told everyone information and discussion is shared in total confidence and not to be shared until agreement on next steps. The evidence that this was made in the lab is piling up. Alina Chan, a molecular biologist at MIT and Harvard, found that the earliest sequences of COVID-19 had barely any evidence of mutation. Now, if it was natural, there should have been a lot more mutations, like in the 2002 SARS outbreak. Chan wrote that it already seemed, quote, pre-adapted to human transmission. In emails back and forth in April 2020 between Fauci and Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, the subject line was, "Conspiracy gains momentum." Fauci was clearly worried about the possibility this came from a lab, but has repeatedly denied it. Now remember Peter Daszak, the president of EcoHealth Alliance, we told you about him. He's the one who admitted he was working with Bat Lady from the Wuhan Institute of Virology to Frankenstein viruses, and the one who gave millions to Wuhan from Fauci to study these bat viruses.
You can manipulate them in the lab pretty easily. It's just spike protein drives a lot of what happens with the coronavirus, zoonotic risk. So you can get the sequence, you can build the protein, and we work with Ralph Barrick at UNC to do this. Insert it into a backbone of another virus, and do some work in the lab.
Now, when Fauci debunked the lab theory, Daszak wrote him an email, personally thanking him and telling him his comments were brave. Daszak was on the WHO commission trip that determined the virus didn't come from a lab. So Fauci's comments directly benefited Daszak. Facebook then put Daszak on its fact-check team. Daszak's job at Facebook was to kill any posts about the Wuhan lab leaks. Zuckerberg also killed the Hunter Biden laptop story. Why does it seem everything the media does benefits China? But there's more. A physicist, Eric Nilsson, wrote Fauci an email in March 2020 saying how China was lying about their COVID deaths. He wrote, quote, "I need to clear my conscience because it's possible, albeit unlikely, that some of what I tell you is new and possibly useful in, at least, saving lives in the USA." Fauci just sent the email to someone from the NIH and wrote, quote, "Too long for me to read." But Fauci had plenty of time to sit down for magazine cover stories, appear on countless TV shows, and even throw out the first pitch at the Nationals game. Fauci's emails with Dr. George Zhao, the director of the Chinese CDC, were also revealed. Did Dr. Fauci ever ask his Chinese colleague about the lab? No. Not one single question about where the virus came from. These emails prove Fauci was warned that China was lying. They had created COVID in a lab. He was worried about it, worried he'd funded it because he did, but did nothing about it, except deceive the American people. Fauci's the highest paid federal employee, making over $400,000 a year. All of that money coming out of your pockets, and you're being lied to. Fauci even wrote a book during the pandemic. Remind you of Andrew Cuomo, maybe. Another deceitful narcissist who profited from the pandemic and bears some responsibility for the death toll. Cuomo and Fauci, both media myths drunk off their own egos.
We're like the modern day De Niro and Pacino. You can be whichever you want. You can be the De Niro or Pacino. Fauci and Cuomo.
Two mobsters. Like Cuomo, Fauci will cruise through softball interviews until the truth finally catches up to him. The media doing everything it can to put that day off.
The true mark of someone is if they look good, even when their personal emails come out. So you pass the test that very few of us would pass.
She thinks these emails look good. There you have it. The media is complicit in covering up Fauci-gate. The media wants to investigate January 6th, but not a pandemic that cost millions of lives, jobs, and an election. Remember, Fauci got Biden elected. This virus kicked Trump out of office. Fauci locked the whole country down instead of just isolating the elderly, giving the Democrats an excuse to scare everybody into staying home so they could loosen election laws and mass mail ballots. Fauci shifted the blame from China to Trump. Members of our own government colluded with the Chinese communists to blame random animals instead of telling us the truth. And scientists exposed themselves just as greedy liars instead of truth seekers. Worried their funding from Fauci would dry up, they shut their traps and signed on to a fake consensus, a forced consensus. The real consensus was they all just wanted to get paid. The science was never settled. They play the fake consensus game with global warming. They just want the grant money and they'll spit out whatever the partisan bureaucrats tell them to. All the so-called experts were wrong. And you were right.